The Promised Land. What would happen if you promised that land, the very same land, to two different peoples at the same time? What if the land you promised isn't even yours to promise away in the first place? Wouldn't that create an irreversible mess that might take generations to resolve, if it can be resolved at all?
For the answer, we only have to look at what the British and French colonial powers did to the Jewish and Arab people who share a belief that biblical land around Jerusalem is their promised land.
This is how the Israeli-Palestinian conflict began. I'm Spartacus Olsson.
I'm Sebastian Brandstetter.
Sebastian, one of our most recent additions to our TimeGhost team, has done the research for and co-written with me this special extra-long episode of TimeGhost Into Context.
Today, due to increasing demand from our community and events tragically unfolding in Israel and Palestine, we will look into the historical beginnings of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We will try to uncover what motivations, mechanisms, and historical events led to today's situation.
To be clear, we are historians and we do not take sides in this conflict. Our side is always humanity, all of humanity, and always humanity, never just a part of humanity. We expressly condemn all forms of hatred and terror and expect all nations to uphold the principles of international law, conflict, and war. To narrate the events unfolding in the world as we speak is not our purpose. It is also not our purpose to assign blame or justify the actions of one or the other party. We simply give you the past events as they unfolded. We hope that may help you all to better understand, if not the causes, then at least some of the historical aspects, and perhaps, in a perfect world, become part of a future solution.
We also do not pretend to have covered every event or every aspect of this conflict, not even in this long an episode. But we do claim that what we will get is to as much of a concise, fair, and precise overview as possible.
Okay, most of the time when dealing with generational, long-lasting conflicts, the roots of the problem reach back far into ages past. In this case, they reach back very far indeed, several millennia, in fact.
The year is 1098 Common Era, and Pope Urban II called for the first of 8 eventual Crusades. The goal? To capture the holy city of Jerusalem. Why, you may ask? At its core, it's really quite simple. Basic geopolitical consideration about power and wealth. The Seljuk Empire had made significant territorial gains against the Byzantines in the decade before. This threatens to change the entire power structure in Asia Minor. For the Christians in the Eastern Roman Empire and in the Holy Roman Empire, control of the region offers strong economic incentives, most notably through trade.
Hence, when Alexios I asked for help from his Western Christian brethren, the motivations are clear. However, this is not what the Pope presents to the general public as his main reason. He and the Catholic Church spread the narrative that the pilgrimage to the Holy City has become perilous and uncertain for most travelers. This message, packaged in the form of propagandistic church sermons, whips up a sort of religious fervor and fanaticism about protecting the cradle of Christianity from heathen influence and ensuring the safe pilgrimage of believers to the holy sites. And in the end, the Pope's ambitions and those of contemporary rulers are not fulfilled, as you may have already guessed by the fact that there were 8 Crusades.
To make a very, very long story short, all this paves the way for 10 centuries of sectarian conflict that continues to ferment strife to this day and has globally become an ingrained aspect of the perceived identity of the region. In other words, Jerusalem has been the hotspot of conflict between the 3 Abrahamic religions since at least 1098. If you count Jewish strife in the region by itself, even all the way back to antiquity. That is why, in our search for answers, we need to tread carefully when examining the importance of Jerusalem and the various conflicts that have been fought over it throughout the centuries.
As we mentioned, one of the reasons for the First Crusade was the threat of Muslim influence in Asia Minor. Roughly 350 years later, on the 19th of May 1453, the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Empire would not only mark the definitive end of Christian influence in Asia Minor, but also its eventual demise in Eastern Europe.
The Ottoman Empire would remain in control of the region for almost 500 years and would shape the region, its people, and its future. The city of Jerusalem can perhaps serve as a proxy to understand the makeup of the Ottoman Empire as a whole. It is a land of many cultures, religions, and peoples. The census taken in Jerusalem from 1562 to 1563 underlines this, as roughly 10% of the population are then Jewish, 12% Christian, and 78% Muslim. Within these distinctions based on religion, many more could be made on culture. Overall, however, the population was rather small, at 12,617 total. Contrary to the West, where Jewish people continually faced persecution and discrimination, from the 16th to the 19th century, they are rather safe and prosper under Ottoman rule.
Now, a quick sidebar here. Yes, the Jews in Jerusalem were relatively safe, compared to Western Europe at least, but they were still not full citizens. Any non-Muslims were considered dhimmi, or people of the pact, based on passages in the Quran. Surah 929, fight against those whom the scriptures were given and who believe not in God, until they pay the tribute out of hand and are humbled. Members of other religions are expected to pay a special tax, wear distinctive clothing, and obey other rules which set them apart from the first-class citizenry of the empire. While not perfect, this two-class system is still significantly less discriminatory than the status quo in Western Christendom.
Even more so, as the conflict within the Western Christian nation intensifies throughout the 17th century, Jewish people are seen as potential allies, diplomats, and spies. As the persecution in Europe continues, Jews from Spain, Sicily, France, and Hungary settle all over the empire. Overall, throughout the existence of the Ottoman Empire, until its very end, its Jews and Arabs generally got along fairly well and without much strife. Because of different diasporas, Jewish people coming to the Ottoman Empire were descendants of people who had migrated to Europe centuries prior.
Two major groups are the Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews. The Sephardic Jews settled in modern Spain, while their precise origin in the region remains unclear. Some sources suggest that members of the Judean ruling class were moved there after the Roman Emperor Titus destroyed Jerusalem in 70 current era. When, in 1492, Isabella and Ferdinand of Spain succeed in bringing all of Spain under Christian rule, the Sephardic Jews are faced with the Edict of Expulsion, essentially giving them the choice between conversion, summary execution, or migration. Similarly, it seems as though the Ashkenazi Jews also hailed from Judea originally. How exactly their distinct community formed so far remains unknown.
Well, what we do know is that, by the Middle Ages, they settled in Middle and Southern Europe. But as their distant Spanish relatives, they were faced with expulsions in England, France, and later Germany, which gradually pushed them eastward. As such, the Ottoman Empire was not the only place that Jewish people sought to escape persecution in Western Europe. The other option was Eastern Europe.
The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth welcomed many disenfranchised Jews throughout the late Middle Ages, and its sizable Jewish population would be absorbed by the Russian Empire later on. Sadly, the situation of relative safety in the Russian Empire would not last, and by the end of the 19th century, Jewish people in Russia were experiencing that from which they had fled again and again: discrimination and persecution. In other words, diasporas. Now, this leads to two essential things. One, two waves of Jewish mass exodus from Russia, the first and second Aliyah. Two, the emergence of Zionism as a political movement.
From 1881 to 1882, Jewish Russians increasingly faced pogroms. It all begins with the assassination of Tsar Alexander II on the 1st of March 1881. As so often in times of turmoil and uncertainty, people look for scapegoats. And, as so often before in the history of Europe, the scapegoats are agents of foreign influence, or in other words, Jews. The 2 years of prosecution, most notably the pogroms of Kiev, Warsaw, and Odessa, lead to the first aliyah, the first ascent in English.
Further prosecution from 1903 to 1905 marks the beginning of the second aliyah, which lasts until 1914. As a result, the Jewish population in the Levant, the region that today stretches along the Mediterranean coast from southern Turkey to the Israeli-Egyptian border, grows from around 24,000 in 1882 to almost 100,000 in 1914. However, the vast majority of Jewish people fleeing Russia go somewhere else, the United States. Between 1907 and 1914 alone, almost 1.5 million Jews passed through Ellis Island, while about 20,000 emigrate to Palestine.
This, despite the fact that over the centuries, several self-proclaimed messiahs had tried to persuade Jews to return to the Torah's promised land with little success. In Eastern Europe, Hovevei Sion, Lovers of Zion, is formed to promote the settlement of Jewish farmers and artisans in Palestine. The individual who will politicize this idea and coin the term Zionism is Theodor Herzl, an Austro-Hungarian journalist. Herzl regards assimilation as the most desirable option for Jewish people, but contends that in the face of centuries of anti-Semitism and persecution, it is simply not possible. In vain, we are loyal patriots, our loyalty in some places running to extremes. We are still cried down as strangers.
The answer to this problem is, in Herzl's eyes, the creation of a Jewish nation-state. He argues that if the Jewish people are forced by external pressure to form a state, it would have to be by migration into one distinct territory. The whole concept of a nation-state as such is a novel concept at the time. Until the creation of Belgium and Greece in 1830, there had not been a single nation-state on the whole planet.
How does one approach such a monumental task, founding a state without any land?
Well, Herzl seemingly has a clear vision of how to get there, and it begins in Basel in 1897 with the First Zionist Congress. Later, he will write in his diary, "Were I to sum up the Basel Congress in a word, it would be this. At Basel, I founded the Jewish state. If I said this out loud today, I would be answered by universal laughter. Perhaps in 5 years, certainly in 50, everyone will know it."
Now, thereby, the idea of a Jewish return to the Promised Land has been combined with the modern notion of a nation-state, and this project will eventually give birth to today's state of Israel, almost to the day 50 years later after the Basel Congress. To get there, Herzl arranges talks with various leaders of large countries, such as Germany and France, but only the British are receptive to the idea, offering 15,500 square kilometers of uninhabited Uganda for settlement. However, the prospects of a new country in the middle of Africa is not very appealing to the Zionists, and they continue to hope for the return to the Promised Land.
They are, however, aware that advocating for the establishment of a Jewish nation-state in the Levant could meet fierce opposition, especially by the Arabs living there and by other international actors. To avoid this problem, their phrasing is carefully fine-tuned, referring to a homeland rather than a state. The main slogan of the Zionist movement at the time is, "A land without people for a people without land."
There is only one problem. There are, in fact, people in the land, as many as 595,000 by 1914 to be exact. Thus, some Zionists know that in order for their endeavor to succeed, at least initially, the goodwill of the native Arab population is of utmost importance, a sentiment not always shared by Jewish settlers, causing concerns within the Zionist movement. As says Zionist humanist Ahad Ham.
Yet what do our brethren do in Palestine? Just the very opposite. Serfs they were in the lands of the diaspora, and suddenly they find themselves in unrestricted freedom, and this change has awakened in them an inclination to despotism. They treat the Arabs with hostility and cruelty, deprive them of their rights, offend them without cause, and even boast of these deeds, and nobody among us opposes this despicable and dangerous inclination.
He also notes that generally, many Zionists are not open to objections that people are already living in the region. Sadly, his words are not heeded, and this is where we can first observe the lines along which the eventual cracks and tensions will appear. Herzl dies in 1904, well before Zionism has fully matured as a political movement, and before the problems outlined by Ham become relevant.
In any case, Herzl's vision will continue to grow and spread to Jewish people across the globe. But then, in 1914, the First World War threatens to completely alter the governance structure and the lives of people in the region of today's Palestine and Israel.
The British Empire will now play a major role in deciding the fate of the entire Middle East. They will be joined by another continent-spanning colonial empire of the time, France.
Naturally, the British expect to win the war, and as such make preparations and agreements in anticipation of their victory. This means negotiating with various global players such as France, but also with smaller regional players and other interest groups. At the heart of all of this diplomacy, there is a clear goal: the greatest possible benefit to Britain.
To make this a reality, the British enter into almost simultaneous negotiations with the French and other Entente powers, local tribes in the southeastern part of the Ottoman Empire, today's Middle East, and the Zionists. While these negotiations do not all start on the same day, they clearly overlap in their preparation and execution. The only problem is that the British make promises they cannot keep. That is to say, they make contradictory promises to varying partners. By 1917, their vindictiveness becomes apparent for all to see.
Okay, so 3 competing promises have been made. The Balfour Declaration of 1917, the letters between Sir Henry McMahon, British High Commissioner of Egypt, and Sharif Hussein, the Emir of Mecca, and a secret agreement with the French. They all center around the same question. How do you carve up the proverbial cake, or more succinctly, who gets what part of the Ottoman Empire's carcass?
The secret deal between France and Britain is facilitated by the diplomats Mark Sykes and François-Georges Picot, hence the name Sykes-Picot Agreement, and it will decide the future of the entire Middle East. Turkey itself will be allowed independence, but largely stay occupied by the Allies. Syria and Mesopotamia will be carved away from Turkey and fall under French and British control respectively. Now, the Syria of 1920 is what we know today as Jordan, Israel, Lebanon, Palestine, and parts of Syria. Mesopotamia is today's Iraq, Kuwait, parts of Syria, and parts of Saudi Arabia.
Now, if you think that the ethnic map of Europe causes problems when the lands are divided into nation-states, this is even worse. Many of the tribes living here are still nomadic. The stationary population is a mixture of various Arab tribes, Shia Muslims, Sunni Muslims, a dozen or so Christian denominations, Jews, and many more. The language ethnicities are just as diverse, with speakers of a variety of Arab dialects, Kurdish, Hebrew, Armenian, Turkish, Persian, and many more smaller languages. These ethnicities are not clearly separated geographically. The colonial power brokering ensures the continued influence of France and Britain in the region. However, it also directly contradicts the promises made to the Zionists and the Sharif.
Now, throughout the Great War, T.E. Lawrence, aka Lawrence of Arabia, and Emir Faisal, the eldest son of the Sheriff of Mecca, head of the Hashemite family, worked together to secure the cooperation of the Arab tribes against the Ottoman Empire. The idea is that Faisal and his father could be Entente-friendly rulers who will bring stability and prosperity to the region. Why the Sharif of Mecca, you might ask?
Well, because as the steward or keeper of Islam's most important holy sites, he is seen as a representative of all Arabs in the region, a sentiment that some Arabs do not share. In the letter exchange, the Sharif clearly demands the independence of the Arab countries and provides exact maps as to what territories he deems to constitute the Arab sphere of influence. This area clearly includes today's Palestine and Israel. In return, the British expect the staging of an Arab revolt against the Ottoman, to which the Sharif agrees. As a response, McMahon notes,
Great Britain is prepared to recognize and support the independence of all Arabs in the regions within the limits demanded by the Sharif of Mecca.
Again, the British goal is to advance Britain's interest. The support from the local tribes against the Ottomans does just that, further destabilizing Ottoman control in the region, while seeding a Britain-friendly population, which could come in handy after the end of the war.
However, the Sykes-Picot Agreement we mentioned earlier outlines a very different future path for the region. France wants control over the whole of Syria and Palestine. The British make some arguments towards fulfilling the promises to the Sharif, but as discussions proceed, gradually compromise away the reality of any establishment of truly autonomous states, putting key areas of it under their own or French control, or as they put it, influence. The spirit of these negotiations is really quite exemplary of the colonial attitude of the time.
That in the blue area France and in the red area Great Britain shall be allowed to establish such direct or indirect administration or control as they desire, and as they may think fit to arrange with the Arab state or confederation of Arab states.
In effect, a significant area of the map provided by the Sharif in the letter exchange, and agreed upon by the British, has become subject to the whims of France and Britain, a vassal state, so to speak. Naturally, this would not sit well with the Arab tribe leaders, so they are not invited to the discussions.
To put it clearly, the British knowingly and purposefully have now made competing promises to the French and Arabs, all in their best interests. If Britain were a person, one might describe them as an egotistic opportunist. Opportunism that segues into vindictiveness when you see how the next conflicting agreement practically programs conflict in the region.
That would be the Balfour Declaration. Well, it's what Zionists have been waiting for ever since they rejected the idea of erecting the Jewish state in Uganda. Support for a Jewish state in Palestine. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object.
The declaration is the direct result of Zionist organizations approaching past, future, and current British government members. Interestingly, Sykes, the namesake of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, will be of most use in this endeavor. The Zionists openly state that they prefer a British protectorate over an American or French one.
But, as expected, the reasons behind the British support of the idea are more complex than mere sympathy for the Jewish cause. Once again, the central motivation is geopolitical power brokering, leading to the biggest possible upside for Britain. Primarily, in 1915 and 16, as the Great War still rages without US involvement, the British want to garner political support among Jewish people for the war effort, especially in the US. They also hope that pro-British Jewish settlers to the region could protect the approaches to the Suez Canal, and thus safeguard a vital route of goods and communication with British colonies further east, especially India. Last but not least, they hope for all these settlers to splinter any anti-British opposition and make it easier to secure natural resources like the as of yet largely untapped oil reserves.
Just one problem. The British are promising away land that they have neither sovereign rights to, nor any argument for having a proprietary interest in. Not to mention, no authority to dispose of. That alone especially enrages many Arab leaders.
While the Balfour Declaration also runs contrary to the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which sees Palestine fall under French control, the British are able to convince the French of the idea of Jewish colonization. So, the French agree to put the area of Palestine under international supervision, which shall eventually lead to the British mandate under the League of Nations. Perhaps the words of later military governor of Palestine, Colonel Ronald Storrs, can best describe the situation.
Palestine, up to now a Muslim country, has fallen into the hands of a Christian power which on the eve of its conquest announced that a considerable portion of its land is to be handed over for colonization purposes to a nowhere very popular people.
Mark how despite the mild self-deprecation, he manages to insert an anti-Semitic undertone.
In any case, The inclusion of the Balfour Declaration as a raison d'être of the British mandate in conflict with the Arab self-determination lays down a foundation built on irreconcilable differences on which the British will now erect a house of cards. However, as already intimated, the British do not openly negotiate competing promises. Otherwise, one or all of their partners could have easily spotted the lack of commitment to any of them.
Yup. All these agreements are made in secret. However, that secrecy will not be possible to maintain. To see how it all begins to unravel, we return to Russia right after the October Revolution in 1917. In their quest for fuel to drive their transformation to the dictatorship of the proletariat, the Bolsheviks leave no stone unturned. This includes scouring the former state archives for any useful information to use politically. Amongst the treasures of political dynamite they find is a copy of the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Lenin, reputedly disgusted by the imperialist ambitions of the agreement, publishes it, along with a slew of Russian imperial treaties.
The Manchester Guardian then reprints the whole agreement on the 26th of November 1917. This causes quite some embarrassment for the French and British, and the Arabs are scandalized. To what degree these emotions eventually paved the way for the next chapter in this sordid drama can only be left to speculation. Nonetheless, a new chapter it is, once the Great War is over.
The war has given wind to the sails of nationalist emotions around the world. Arguably, this is the moment when the idea of nation-states, countries founded on some kind of discrete geography and shared identity, ceases to be a largely academic idea to popular sentiment. Okay, this is of course a long process that began more than a century earlier, but now that millions of men from across the globe have fought side by side for their nation, identities that before 1914 focused on family, tribe, or region have become supplanted by the idea of a common interest and identity based on larger geopolitical constructs, previously mainly of interest to a small ruling class. Paradoxically, at the same time, a general distrust of the larger imperial order of the world and the ruling classes has led to a majority support for the idea of self-determination. It is by no means a class struggle. These emotions supersede class and ethnicity, and if not before, at the Paris Peace Conference they become universally accepted principles, at least for the peoples of America and Europe.
Breaking a lance for the Arab world to be included in this game of nation-making is Faisal, by now the true representative of the Arab interest and prospective king of a pan-Arabic nation. Just before the Paris Conference, he meets with several major Zionist leaders. Most significantly, he befriends biochemist Dr. Chaim Weizmann, one of the main driving forces behind the Balfour Declaration and president of the British Zionist Federation. On paper, Weizmann is a liberal Zionist who claims that for a Jewish state in Palestine to have success, it must be in concert with Arab interest. Privately, however, he has called Arabs treacherous, arrogant, uneducated, and greedy, and has complained to the British that the system in Palestine does not take into account the fact that there is a fundamental qualitative difference between Jew and Arab. Faisal and Weizmann find common ground in similar opinions about the Palestinian Arabs. Weizmann writes to his wife that Faisal was contemptuous of the Palestinian Arabs whom he doesn't even regard as Arabs.
The outcome of their meeting is the Faisal-Weizmann Declaration. In it, Faisal echoes the Balfour Declaration, the establishment of a Jewish home in Palestine. He hopes that the official acceptance of the Balfour Declaration would give him the support of the Zionists, which, in turn, could lobby the British on behalf of an independent Greater Syria. Remarkably, Although facing enormous opposition to any such idea, Faisal manages to get the majority of the Arab leaders on board for the idea of a Jewish semi-autonomous state in Palestine, along with Arab independence within a pan-Arabic federation. Hopes that look like they may come true, as the British now reiterate their promises of Arab independence to Faisal, who begins to prepare to truly unify the Arab tribes behind a common cause.
Yes, if it only would be that simple. The French are not at all happy about this development and pressure the British to come back to the principle of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, with the addition of a British mandate in Palestine. In a not too surprising turn of developments, the British secretly abandon all their promises to Faisal. Instead of a united federation of the Arab tribes, they and Faisal end up in a brief war with the French when the Arabs have finally had enough and take up arms to get their demands.
A brief war it is, but it's also a long story of how the Arab tribes fall apart again, and the Arab factions that are still at conflict more than 100 years later are formed. Within that, Faisal will become the first king of Iraq, but all of that is a tale for another day. Before that can happen, Faisal surrenders to the French in 1920 and is extradited to Britain.
The defeat of Faisal and the Arab leaders in 1920 marks the moment when developments more or less become set in stone, and a new chapter begins, the Middle East under Western rather than Ottoman influence.
Already before the Arab rebellion fails, the British mandate in Palestine, the region that will eventually become Palestine, Israel, and parts of Jordan and Lebanon, come under British military rule. In 1920, a civilian administration under Sir Herbert Manuel takes charge.
Now, strictly speaking, Britain has no right to occupy the territory according to international law, which, by the way, is a novel concept pretty much forged at the Paris Peace Conference with the creation of the League of Nations. In any case, legal or not, the League agrees that Palestine will fall under British rule, and on the 24th of July 1923, with the Treaty of Lausanne, what is already a de facto reality will be formalized.
Meanwhile, in 1920, the tensions inside the Middle East continue to mount. Anything that is seen as a threat to a path towards Arab independence at some point is a hot potato. While the leaders around Faisal have heard of the Balfour Declaration, the general population has not. Moreover, leaders who were maybe swayed by Faisal now oppose any idea of Jewish autonomy.
Then, when Manuel's administration comes in, they make the declaration public. Taken as an indication that it will be fulfilled, outrage grows. And on the 4th of April 1920, violent protests engulf the holy city of Jerusalem. At the end of the riot, there are scores of dead and injured on both sides. On the first day alone, 150 Jews are injured.
However, the British are not as united behind the Zionist cause as they seem to be, at least not yet. In fact, it may be that touting the declaration has more sinister reasons.
Cut to a year later, 1921, and Hay Amin el-Husseini. He is now appointed Grand Mufti of Jerusalem and president of the newly created Supreme Muslim Council, the most authoritative religious legislative body in the Palestinian Muslim community. Husseini now begins to organize larger-scale operations to terrorize Jews. At the same time, Colonel Richard Meinertzhagen, former head of British security in Cairo, writes in his diary that British officials incline towards the exclusion of Zionism in Palestine.
Now let's go back to Easter 1920, only days before the Jerusalem riots, when Colonel Waters Taylor, financial advisor to the military administration in Palestine from 1919 to 1923, meets with Husseini. Is it a coincidence that the riots start right after? According to Meinertzhagen, it most certainly is not. He states that in the talks, Taylor encourages Arab violence against the Jews, going as far as to suggest to Husseini that
He had a great opportunity at Easter to show the world that Zionism was unpopular, not only with the Palestine administration, but in Whitehall, and if disturbances of sufficient violence occurred in Jerusalem at Easter, both General Balfour, chief administrator in Palestine, and General Allenby, commander of Egyptian force and High Commissioner of Egypt, would advocate the abandonment of the Jewish home. Waters Taylor explained that freedom could only be attained through violence.
It is unclear whether the British officers are motivated by anti-Jewish sentiments on their part or simple political considerations. Yet, the two-faced nature of the British does not end there.
After the riots, Husseini, who has fled to Jordan, is sentenced to 10 years in prison in absentia. Then, again in 1921, British Arabists are able to convince the High Commissioner to pardon Husseini and appoint him as Mufti again. Subsequently, more riots follow in 1921, and 43 Jews die as a result. The Haycraft Commission is set up to evaluate the cause of these riots and will find that the fundamental cause of the acts of violence was a feeling among the Arabs of discontent with and hostility to the Jews due to political and economic causes and connected with Jewish immigration, and with their conception of Zionist policy as derived from Jewish exponents.
Husseini will play a major role in the development of the conflict as he consolidates his power over the Arab population in Palestine. He uses his religiously derived authority to gain control over mosques, schools, and the courts. As a result, no Arab can reach an influential position without being loyal to him and his inherently anti-Jewish stances.
In his role as Palestinian spokesperson, towards the end of 1921, he writes Winston Churchill, at the time colonial secretary. He demands that restrictions be put on Jewish immigration and that Palestine, as a territory, be united with Transjordan and Syria. These demands are partially based on developments outside of the mandate of Palestine. While at least theoretically, the area west of the Jordan, Palestine, and east of the Jordan, Transjordan, fall under one mandate, the British effectively treat them as two separate entities. This means that in Transjordan, the British have no ambition to establish a Jewish home, and their sole focus is a path towards Arab self-determination. Going even further, they prohibit any Jewish immigration to Transjordan.
It must have been quite something for the Arabs living in Palestine. Just across the river, the reasons for their riots and protests are non-existent, and the British actively seek to enable Arab self-determination. Already in 1923, Transjordan will achieve quasi-independence with a Hashemite king at the helm nonetheless.
And that would be Emir Abdullah I, Faisal's brother. In any case, to be clear, these British divisions of the territory is in no way, shape, or form reflected by the reality on the ground. As we said earlier, it's one ethnic or cultural group and the other separated by a pencil line drawn in some fancy back office in London that in no way respects the tribal and nomadic culture of the region.
But back to Churchill and Husseini's demands to end Zionism in Palestine. How does Winston respond? Does Husseini get what he wants?
Well, no. The Churchill White Paper, or Churchill Memorandum, doubles down on the Balfour Declaration. Several years later, while addressing the House of Commons, Churchill will explain the purpose of the White Paper. To make it clear that the establishment of self-governing institutions in Palestine was to be subordinated to the paramount pledge and obligation of establishing a Jewish national home in Palestine.
As you can imagine, essentially subordinating the self-governance of Arabs in the region to the creation of a Jewish national home does nothing to lessen the tensions. With their backs now fully supported by the British government, the Zionists start to continue their efforts to create a Jewish state in Palestine. Their main tools to facilitate this grand endeavor are twofold: immigration and land purchases.
In 1922, the Jews number only about 84,000, while the Arabs in the region number roughly 8 times that. However, this is about to change. Throughout the 20s, about 100,000 Jewish immigrants will arrive in Palestine, leading to a total Jewish population of roughly 165,000 by 1929. Overall, the Jewish population in Palestine has more than doubled since 1918. Accordingly, the ratio of Arabs to Jews has shifted from 10 to 1 to 5 to 1. With such an influx of people, the ownership of land in Palestine has also changed rather drastically. In 1920, it was estimated that around 650 square kilometers, or roughly 250 square miles, were under Jewish ownership, which constituted just shy of 2.5% of the total land area.
Fast forward to 1929, and Jewish land ownership has grown to 1,200 square kilometers, nearly doubling, and now constituting about 5% of the total land area. Looking at the total land area is problematic, however, since untillable land is not really worth much, and there's quite a lot of it in the area. In total, out of 26,000 square kilometers, about 6,500 are arable. Of these, the Jewish community possesses round about 1/6 in 1929.
Well, you might say 1/6 of the land for 1/5 of the people? That does not seem too unfair.
There is one more decisive factor that so far we have not looked at and which heavily influences Arab sentiments about Jewish immigration and land ownership. It is not the land ownership per se that causes so much Arab opposition, but how the land ownership is managed by the Jewish communities. In today's terms, you might describe the practice simply as racial discrimination. Only Jewish laborers are allowed to work on the Jewish land and in Jewish settlements. The land does not simply change ownership from an Arab to a Jew, but
it ceases to be land from which the Arab can gain any advantage either now or at any time in the future. Not only can he never hope to lease or to cultivate it, but he is deprived forever from employment on that land, nor can anyone help him by purchasing the land and restoring it to common use.
These labor policies also run contrary to the articles of the mandate. The Zionist organization attempts to not assume any blame by not openly advocating their stringent labor policies. Some Zionist leaders, including Weizmann, also oppose the practices. For example, at the Zionist Congress of 1931, a resolution is passed that solemnly declared the desire of the Jewish people to live with the Arab people to develop the homeland common to both into a prosperous community which would ensure the growth of the peoples.
Resolutions or not, the practices feed into more anger, suspicion, and hatred in the region. The Arabs, faced with the reality that Britain openly favors Zionist efforts over Arab self-determination, feel betrayed. Jews fleeing persecution in Europe now face the same in the Promised Land.
In August 1929, the conflict once again escalates as a dispute over the Western Wall in Jerusalem causes riots by Palestinian Arabs. Since 1925, Jews have been blocked access to the Wailing Wall as a measure by the British to calm emotions by segregation.
It all begins with a march on the Wailing Wall by 6,000 far-right Jewish Zionists demanding access to the wall. The protesters are unarmed, and later reports conclude that the demonstration proceeds peacefully. Nevertheless, false rumors that the Jews are about to seize the Al-Aqsa Mosque and that they are attacking, even slaughtering Muslims spread. Inflammatory articles in the press of both sides fan hatred. Incensed Arab mobs then begin destroying Jewish-owned property and beating Jewish people they find in the streets, even killing them. The riots soon spread beyond Jerusalem. The British police respond with gunfire, and a few Jewish activists answer with violence of their own. A week of bloody fighting leaves 133 Jewish Palestinians and 116 Arab Palestinians dead, with hundreds more wounded.
Now, note that we deliberately noted that the dead on both sides are Palestinians. You see, these events bring a deepening rift to light. Many of the dead and wounded Jews are not immigrants, not even Zionists.
The collective punishment of Jewish communities in Palestine who had come to be there irrespective of Zionist ambition in ages past motivates more Jews to closely align themselves with the Zionist project. Likewise, the violent response by the British police and a minority of Zionist activists further radicalizes some people in the Arab community. A cycle of violence giving birth to more violence that will last into our days has begun.
These events force a shift in British policy for the Mandate in Palestine. The Shaw and Hope Simmons commissions, appointed to assess the events, amongst other things, heightens the awareness of the dangerous situation in Palestine. As a result, two immediate measures are taken in 1930, the increase of British troops in the region and a new policy on Palestine called the Pasfield White Paper. In it, Palestinians as well as Jewish leaders are reprimanded. The Jews for exerting pressure on officials to comply with Zionist wishes, and the Arabs for excessively demanding self-determination. Both of them, according to the report, would render it impossible to carry out in the fullest sense the double undertaking.
This marks an important shift from the Churchill Memorandum, as now, at least on paper, the British make an effort to give the same importance to the creation of a Jewish home and an Arab self-determination. More specifically, this means that the British are working towards a united Arab-Jewish state. You could call it a one-state solution.
Furthermore, the paper communicates the clear intent of reasserting British authority over the areas of immigration and land transfers, which ever since the Churchill Memorandum had practically been in the hands of the Zionists. Last, the paper also calls for the creation of a common legislature, wherein both Arabs and Jews could deliberate and reach a deeper understanding of each other.
After more than a decade of fanning dissent, this change of tack by the British is a call into a canyon of their own digging.
Zionists are not happy with the change and make their displeasure known. By 1931, their efforts reach fruition, and Dr. Weizmann receives a letter from the British Prime Minister, Ramsay MacDonald, wherein the PM once again puts the Zionists' goals above rather than alongside those of Arab self-determination. In a nutshell, the Churchill Memorandum has been reinstated, and, unsurprisingly, Palestinian Arabs feel shortchanged once again as Zionists, with renewed, unquestioning British support, renew immigration and land purchase efforts.
But there is a more dire threat to Jewish Europeans than simply the desire for a country of their own driving them to Palestine. Remember that Herzl's whole reason behind the Zionist movement had been the continued and merciless persecution of Jews throughout the centuries. By the end of the 19th century, it was clear beyond any doubt that for Jewish Europeans, assimilation was simply not a viable option. Herzl would be proven right again during the Third Aliyah, which lasted from 1919 to 1923. The Russian Revolution of 1917 led to a whole new scale of pogroms in Eastern Europe, and in Ukraine from 1918 to 1921, more than 100,000 Jews were killed, with acts of killing reaching an almost genocidal scale. Whereas earlier, the goal had been to drive the Jews out, now it seemed as if the goal was their complete eradication.
These mass killings are often forgotten in light of the Great Shoah, the Holocaust, but the sheer scale of the violence leads some, like French writer and journalist Anatole France, to publicly question the security of close to 10 million Jews living in Europe, and how right he would turn out to be.
As many of you will know, by now in the early 1930s, anti-Semitism in the whole of Europe is on the rise, as is Jewish immigration. Combined with renewed British support of Zionism over self-determination, this drives immigration to Palestine to record levels. Between 1930 and 1939, more than 230,000 Jews arrive in Palestine, making their total population swell to somewhere around 450,000, turning the 1-to-5 ratio of 1929 into one of 1-to-3. At the same time, land ownership also grows, although not that drastically, by 300 square kilometers to 1,500 total, reaching almost 6% of the total landmass. Since nothing about the British policy changed, and immigration continues the same as it had in the 1920s, the result would also be similar. However, this time it is not just a Arab revolution, but the Arab revolt, and it no longer primarily targets the Jews. It was an open rebellion of the Palestinian Arabs, assisted by fellow Arabs from other countries against British mandatory rule.
In April 1936, things kick off with Grand Mufti of Jerusalem Husseini and the Arab Higher Committee calling for a general strike. As the strike continues, violence increases, and the first attacks on British troops, police stations, and Jewish settlements take place. On the Palestinian side, one organization that plays a central role is the Black Hand. Founded in 1930 after the last uprising, it is an anti-Zionist, anti-British jihadist organization led by Izz ad-Din al-Qassam, a Syrian sheikh. Under al-Qassam, the Black Hand now commits terror attacks against Jewish immigrants and British residents.
Al-Qassam dies in 1935, but his movement continues in the same spirit and dials up the terror. In all, around 7,000 Arabs are actively fighting the British by 1938. The British respond brutally by razing villages, looting, and even executions. The destruction of food and water supplies becomes standard practice to make the Arabs pay for their disobedience. By the time the revolt loses steam in 1939, 5,000 Arab fighters have been killed.
While the British may have succeeded at quenching the Arab violence, the uprising has not been for naught. Already in 1937, in light of determined Arab resistance, the British realized that their current policy, as well as their more general ambition of fulfilling the dual obligations, are not feasible. However vigorously and consistently maintained, it will not solve the problem. It will not allay, it will exacerbate the quarrel between the Arabs and the Jews. The establishment of a single self-governing Palestine will remain just as impractical as it is now.
The solution to the problem, in Solomonian fashion, would be bifurcation, or in other words, the splitting of Palestine into two, the two-state solution. But partition, as you might imagine, is unacceptable to Arab nationals. They've not just fought for a year and a half to lose a third of their country to the Zionists. So there is yet another change of heart among the colonial thinkers in London. Further examination has shown that the political, administrative, and financial difficulties involved in the proposal to create independent Arab and Jewish states inside Palestine are so great that this solution of the problem is impracticable.
So there's a new, brilliant, so far unthought of solution, right?
No.
Okay. A workable solution which at least improves the situation somewhat?
No.
Do they go back to the way things were?
Yes.
You gotta be kidding me.
Well, to be fair, there is some change. In yet another white paper, the British decide to terminate the mandate in 1949, by which time both Palestinians and Jews would share in government. So, back to dual ambitions. However, they also renounce any intention to create a Jewish state in Palestine, effectively nullifying the Balfour Declaration. At the same time, they also reject all Arab demands for self-determination, and Jewish immigration is limited to 10,000 a year for the next 5 years.
This is arguably the best example of bad timing in all of human history. Nazi Germany has by now graduated from anti-Semitic rhetoric and oppression in Germany itself to launch a war aimed to annihilate all Jewish people in Europe.
With that as backdrop, the Jewish community is incensed by the new white paper, with some even proposing a Jewish revolt against the British. However, for most, the defeat of Nazi Germany seems most important. As such, the leader of the Jews in Palestine, David Ben-Gurion, states in 1939, "Support the British as if there is no white paper, and oppose the white paper as if there is no war." While in 1939, it is certainly known that the Nazis are more than hostile towards anyone perceived as or actually Jewish, the lengths they will go to fulfill their genocidal intent is not yet public knowledge.
As a matter of fact, many believe that all the Nazis want is to get the Jews out of Europe. And until 1941, they might have been sort of right. Within the higher Nazi echelons, the method to purge Europe from Jews, the final solution, is still under debate. Among the proposed ideas presented as an alternative to immediate mass murder is to resettle the Jews in the furthest corners of the soon-to-be 1,000-year Reich, somewhere in the Lublin region between the Bug and Vistula rivers. Some other proposals are far more ambitious than this, suggesting that the Jews be resettled in Madagascar.
To be clear, though, the extermination of Europe's Jews is always the goal. It's the method and speed. Generational genocide by forced sterilization of slaves inside the Reich, faster by succumbing to an unsustainable migration to, for instance, Madagascar, or immediate by mass murder. By the summer of 1941, the faction advocating immediate mass murder prevails, and the Holocaust begins with pogroms during Operation Barbarossa to invade the Soviet Union.
The governments in Moscow, Washington, D.C., and Great Britain become aware of the ongoing slaughter at latest by autumn of 1941, but it takes until May 42 for the public to find out, when the BBC will first report on the mass killings of Polish Jews.
By then, Operation Deinhard and the 100 deadliest day of the Holocaust are about to begin. These 100 days constitute the biggest act of mass murder per day in known human history. And building on the Holocaust by bullets in the preceding months, the slaughter will continue until the last day of the war, killing over 6 million, 68% of all Jewish people still living in Europe in 1939, close to 90% of anyone deemed Jewish and unfortunate enough to end up in the hands of the Nazis. Before all of that happens, not even the Jews themselves could imagine the true scale of horror about to unfold.
In their ignorance, some even thought the Nazis could be instrumentalized against the British.
Yeah, until now in our story, Jewish opposition to the British in Palestine has mostly been through diplomacy and political pressure. Yet there have also been a smaller movement of militant opposition and Zionism. In 1920, the Haganah Defense was formed as a paramilitary defensive body to protect settlers and other Jewish Palestinians. Frustrated by a lack of progress, offshoots from Haganah chose a more aggressive approach.
Chief among them, perhaps the Irgun, the few hundred-strong underground militia labels itself as far-right and has been fighting both Arab nationalists and the British colonial administration, among other things, during the Arab revolts.
When the war breaks out, Irgun officially ceases all work against the British in light of the bigger German threat. Some members grow dissatisfied with this decision, and in August 1940, a former Irgun member, Abraham Stern, forms Lehi, a breakaway group. Their goal is to force the British out of Palestine immediately to form a Jewish state.
Now, in a rather counterintuitive development, to facilitate their aims, in 1941, Stern suggests collaboration with the Germans. Despite growing evidence of the Nazis' sinister aims, Stern is under the impression that the Nazis want to make their land Judenrein, free of Jews, through emigration.
So, Stern believes that if the Zionists in Palestine helped Nazi Germany in conquering the Middle East, the Nazis, in turn, would help them establish a Jewish state in Palestine. As a cherry on top, the Jews expelled from Nazi-controlled Europe could migrate there as well. The Nazis never answer the proposal, and it costs the organization and Stern himself much support. He becomes a pariah and is killed by British police the same year.
On the other side of the conflict, far less paradoxically, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Husseini, also looks to German Führer Adolf Hitler and the Nazis for support. Now, we've made a video about him, especially on our World War II channel. It's quite interesting. Link is in the description. To make a long story short, the Nazis do take him in, but his efforts in the end amount to little other than serving Nazi propaganda and recruiting a limited force of Arab fighters for Germany who end up fighting in Europe for Germany, not Palestine.
However, except for minor exceptions like these, overall World War II generally means a relaxation of tensions between Arabs and Jews in Palestine, at least compared to before. Tensions between the British and the Zionists, on the other hand, are worsening steadily.
The limit on Jewish migration of 10,000 per year is by now far more than a mere slap in the face of the Zionist leaders. Hundreds of thousands of Jews fleeing mass murder in Europe are turned back to die as a result. The situation is made worse by most Western democracies, amongst them the US and Great Britain, refusing to take in any significant number of Jewish refugees, even as the Holocaust becomes public knowledge.
In 1942, even with mounting detailed and confirmed reports on the abhorrent reality of the war against humanity, the British refused to lift the limit on migration, and resentment of the Jews towards the British grew. While illegal immigration to Palestine does grow, this is a trickle of people saved when compared to the growing stream of Nazi freight trains bringing Europeans deemed to be Jewish to the death factories and concentration camps. By 1944, some Jewish paramilitary organizations have had enough, and the Irgun declares, "There is no longer any armistice between the Jewish people and the British administration in Eretz Israel, which hands our brothers over to Hitler." Armed action follows promptly.
On the 27th of February 1944, income tax offices in Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, and Haifa are bombed. Yet, at this time, the majority of the Orthodox Zionists in Palestine are still not in favor of an armed struggle against the British and condemn the attackers. All the while, the Arab Palestinians watch and are surprised by the Jewish attacks and the lackluster response of the British.
With the Mufti stuck doing radio broadcasts in Berlin, more or less, they are, however, leaderless and seemingly wait until the end of the war to see Britain's further course, before making any concrete plans. Until 1945, when the scale and horror of the Nazi extermination becomes visible in images and testimony, there will also be no unified Zionist revolution against the British.
That year, a new Labour government in Britain promises to repeal the immigration ban. Even Irgun and Lehi briefly put down their weapons in anticipation. However, the promises are again not met. Strict limits on Jewish immigration to Palestine stay in place, while 250,000 displaced Jews, survivors of the Holocaust, are spread across Europe. This broken promise, against the backdrop of the biggest genocide in known history, is the straw that breaks the camel's back, launching a wave of active Jewish resistance against the British, and a united Jewish revolt emerges.
Police stations are now attacked, immigrant detainment facilities raided, policemen shot, bombs set off, and trains derailed. In response, the British used the freed manpower from the end of World War II to increase its military presence in the Mandate. By 1946, they will have around 80,000 troops stationed there. Curfews, police searches, arrests, and detentions become the norm for the Arab and Jewish population alike living in the Mandate.
The genocide also brings a change in the international perception of Zionism.
To even a casual observer, the dreadful fate of 6 million Jews has clearly, and once and for all, cemented the tragic truth behind Herzl's insight in Der Judenstaat, that assimilation was never an option. So while before the war, international public support for a Jewish nation-state had been waning, it now receives growing solidarity.
On the other hand, the forces behind the Arab Revolt of 1936 also start to regain some steam, and tensions between the Jews and Arabs again rise to pre-war levels. The ongoing and sizable illegal immigration during and after the war further feeds Arab worries. By 1946, the Jewish population grows by another 100,000 to around 630,000. The Arab population has also grown since 1922 and numbers 1.2 million. So, in only 3 decades, the ratio of Jewish Palestinians to Arab Palestinians has gone from 1 to 5 to 1 to 2.
To put it succinctly, the situation looks to be a completely hopeless mess. The Arabs fight against the Jews and the Jews fight the Arabs and the British, who have abandoned them, and the British desperately try to retain some level of control over the region. On November 30th, 1947, it all descends into a full-out civil war.
The trigger is the adoption of Resolution 181-2 by the newly formed United Nations General Assembly on November 29th. Now, in February, the British had announced that they will relinquish their mandate in 1948. A resolution of the growing fiasco is left to the young United Nations. The proposal is a plan of partition, in other words, a two-state solution. While the Jews rejoice at this proposal for an officially recognized Jewish state, Arab protests erupt all throughout the mandate and soon spread to the rest of the entire Middle East. For the Arabs, partition means, above anything else, war.
Or, as Secretary General of the Arab League, Abdul Rahman Assam Pasha puts it, "The Arab world is not in the mood to compromise. We shall fight. You will gain nothing by peaceful means and compromises. It is too late to speak of peaceful solutions." An atmosphere of violence engulfs the entire region, and the powder keg finally explodes. Buses are attacked, markets are bombed, and retaliatory attacks on villages on both sides are conducted.
By the end of December 1947, the 100,000 Jewish residents of Jerusalem are under blockade. Throughout the entirety of this chaos, the British do little more than focus on the extraction of their personnel and material resources from the region with as few losses as possible.
Finally, on May 14th, 1948, the British completely withdraw. What follows, the second phase of the Civil War, or the 1948 War, will become known in the Arab world as the First Palestine War, by Palestinians as Al-Nakba, the disaster, and by Jews, Milhemet Hagatzmat-Hut, the War of Independence.
At the beginning of the Civil War, the Arab forces had the clear advantage in manpower, while the Jews had more weaponry, better organization, and had extensively prepared for the war since 1945. Nevertheless, the Haganah, now on its way to become the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, is largely on the defensive during the first 4 months of hostilities.
Until March of 1948, the conflict is characterized by gradually expanding, continuously small-scale, small-unit fighting with no clear front lines. At the same time, the call for a jihad reverberates around the Arab world. And while many volunteers are available, any efforts are marred by lack of organization, training facilities, and funding. The Arab High Council is not only struggling to support the war materially, but is also beset by paralyzing internal differences.
The better organized and unified Israelis are laser focused on the procurement of small and heavy weapons and aeroplanes. In post-World War Europe, there is an abundance of surplus arms. The Israelis collect a potpourri of weapons from across the World War belligerents. 10 S-199 Messerschmitt Avia fighters, thousands of Mauser rifles, NG-34s, millions of rounds of ammunition from Czechoslovakia, 50 65mm guns, 12 120mm mortars, 10 H-35 light tanks, and a large number of half-tracks from France. And while the US publicly backtracks on any active support, even for the partition plan, they are still willing to supply equipment, some repainted and defined as agricultural.
On May 14th, the day of the British departure, and just after the British High Commissioner had left Jerusalem for good, chairman of the Jewish Agency and soon-to-be First Prime Minister of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, speaking to other Jewish leaders, members of the National Council, the People's Administration, the Zionist General Council, and party politician, announces, "The land of Israel was the birthplace of the Jewish people. Here, their spiritual, religious, and national identity was formed. Accordingly to the UN resolution, we hereby proclaim the establishment of the Jewish state, the State of Israel."
Technically, and perhaps legally, that transforms the war from a civil war to an international conflict.
The same day, forces from Iraq, Egypt, Transjordan, Lebanon, and Syria attacked the newly formed Jewish state. The Arab coalition immediately occupied the areas in southern and eastern Palestine, not under Jewish control as per UN resolution. Next, they capture East Jerusalem. On paper, this seems quite daunting. 6 countries fighting against a country just a day old, and in the beginning, it certainly is. The Jewish community suffered heavy casualties. It reeled from the shock of contact with regular Arab armies, and it suffered an ordeal which left indelible marks on the national psyche. For the people who lived through this ordeal, the sense of being me'at min mul rabim, the few against the many, could not have been more real.
However, Already in the early days of the international conflict, despite being numerically inferior, the highly motivated and by now comparatively well-equipped Israeli forces successfully repel repeated Arab attacks on their positions. While the UN manages to broker ceasefires during the conflict, both sides disregard the stipulations of the agreement and use the time to improve their positions. More weapons export to Israel also arrived during the first truce between the 11th of June and the 9th of July 1948, greatly enhancing its military capabilities.
Meanwhile, infighting between various Arab states increases during this first truce. For Emir Abdullah of Transjordan, the war is effectively over. He wants to incorporate what is left of eastern Palestine into a new Jordanian kingdom and unsuccessfully lobbies other Arab states to agree to this solution.
Recently, some revisionist historians have suggested that this infighting between the Arab states had a larger effect on the outcome of the war than previously assumed. One could even go so far as to see the war as an inter-Arab conflict, which the Israeli forces ably exploited to conquer Palestine. You see, although the Arab armies do not openly fight each other, their actions are mutually destructive. Instead of working together and fighting the Zionists as one cohesive force, they wait while the Israelis send home one Arab army after the other. The two major factions involved in this inner Arab dispute are the Hashemite bloc, represented by Emir Abdullah, and the Egyptian, Saudi, and Syrian bloc.
The plan of Emir Abdullah is the same dream his brother Faisal had after World War I, the Kingdom of Greater Syria. Unsurprisingly, the overarching goal of the Syrians is to prevent this from happening. The Egyptians and Saudis similarly do not want a kingdom of Greater Syria. Thus, the Arab states are more concerned with their national interests than with defeating the Zionists or helping the Palestinians. Painted in this light, the war seems not to have been for Israel to win, but rather for the Arabs to lose.
Sadly, the war continues for another year, and in a cruel twist of fate, the Palestinian Arabs now suffer the fate from which the Zionists argue a right to their state: diaspora.
By early 1949, the Israelis have successfully occupied all of the Negev, the area in the south of today's Israel, except for the Gaza Strip. Between February and July 1949, armistice agreements are signed between Israel and each of the Arab states, and temporary frontiers are established. But while the war officially ends, the suffering does not.
The Arab Palestinians suffer the most in this conflict, and one sobering number can perhaps best illustrate that point: 167,100.
But that's not the number of casualties, right?
Right. Luckily, by comparison to many other concurrent wars, the casualty rates are fairly low. On the Israeli side, 6,000 are killed, 4,000 soldiers and 2,000 civilians. On the Arab side, slightly over 10,000 soldiers and civilians lose their lives. 167,100 is the number of Palestinians living in Palestine in 1950.
Remember, in 1946, they numbered over 1.2 million, so more than 750,000 Arab Palestinian civilians. Roughly 75% of the entire Arab population have fled or been forcefully expelled from their homes. Some regions in Palestine, such as Haifa, lose as much as 90% of their Arab population. During their 1948 counteroffensive, the IDF carry out several ethnic cleansing operations such as Operation Dani or Operation Yoav. During the latter alone, no less than 8 massacres against Arabs are committed by the IDF and 200,000 to 220,000 people driven into flight. Men, women, and children whose families have lived in that region since anyone could remember now are driven from their homeland.
They will end up in refugee camps set up by the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East in 1949. 53 refugee camps will be created on both sides of the River Jordan, in the Gaza Strip, in Lebanon, and in Syria. For the first 8 years, these camps are nothing more than tent cities, lacking basic infrastructure and supply of goods. To date, in 2023, none of the refugees have been allowed to return to their homes. Through population growth, the refugees have reached almost 6 million. It remains the longest unresolved refugee crisis in the world. So, while the beginning of the war and the isolation of Israel decisively shape its national psyche, for the native Arabs, war, defeat, humiliation, and panicked flight do the same.
The root of this conflict is often framed as purely religious and ethnic differences. It's far more complicated than that. And then again, it's far simpler than that. It's about one simple basic human need. To have a home, a place where we can feel safe, be ourselves, share food, have protection from the elements, and the love of our closest and dearest. When you take that away from any of us, we will run wild and act like feral animals, flee or fight with teeth and claws to protect our safe haven and our loved ones. On one side, you have millions of people who have for generations been denied that right time and time again to be driven from house to house, village to village, town to town, city to city, country to country, and then finally by train into the furnaces of hell by the millions. Simply for being the sons and daughters of their parents. No other reason. On the other side, you have a people held in bondage by imperial interests in faraway cities for centuries, whose development into the comfort and relative safety of the modern world was denied them to serve the colonial chauvinism of people they have never even met. A people now driven into exile by the other disenfranchised people, simply because both sides were fooled, lied to, and pitted against each other. That is the tragedy of the Promised Land. Its promises are always a robbery, a lie, and the betrayal of a promise made to someone else. Perhaps it is not so much a promised land as a cursed land, as long as we cannot accept the absolute covenant of universal and equal rights and work together to create prosperity and safety for all of us. For that, we need to accept that my suffering is not more terrible than yours, and your success is not my failure. Why do we make this so difficult?
If you want to learn more about the interwar events that led to World War II, check out our Between Two Wars series right here. It is the TimeGhost army that enables us to make all of our content. Join at patreon.com or on timeghost.tv.
Never forget.